Thank you so much. And there's nothing like the presentation about data at 3 p.m. when everyone's about to nod off, so please don't. To get started before the panel discussion, I want to talk to you a little bit about how data can be used in placemaking or in making great places. And I use this image on the slide when I first talk about this because this is a sort of a future Jetsons cartoon image of what a future community might look like. And there is a lot of evangelism around at the moment about technology and about big data and innovation and all of the other taglines. And I think it's important for us to be thinking about how to get past the hype and think about how to make great places. And so I want to call out the elephant in the room right at the beginning, because I am from a startup. I founded a data analytics startup called Neighbourlytics, but we use technology as a way of looking at the well-being and success of communities rather than just as like some other big data platform, because God knows there are lots of them out there. So the question that I want to ask when I'm thinking about great places is firstly to ask, how are we doing when it comes to communities in Australia? And you guys here are the experts in this far more than me in many ways, but there are all sorts of statistics about Australian communities right now around underutilised land, around people not knowing their neighbours and the impact of that, around the safety of women particularly. I live in Melbourne at the moment. It's a big topic in Melbourne, right in the urban areas and also the surrounding growth areas as well, and the impact that has on people's ability to participate in the economy. It's not just about personal safety, but participation in the community is a big impact of that. And then there's all sorts of other statistics coming out at the moment as well around the impact that loneliness has on our health. And we've worked with the local government in Victoria who directly attributes the high domestic violence rates to the poor quality neighbourhood design. So there's a lot of stuff we can get wrong when we get our urban planning or our sort of neighbourhood design wrong. And I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but when we're asking how are we doing, we've got to be thinking about stuff like this. And if we're wanting to really track performance, we need to be able to measure it. That's what this session is about in many ways, is looking at how we can understand, how we're doing and how we can track that change. But there's not that many great sources of data about community performance, and it's actually very, very hard to get real-time, hyper-local information about how communities are performing. Government census data is a year old by the time that it's released. Focus groups and observation surveys, online surveys, there's lots of great ways of doing this now, but they're not exactly real-time. You can't be doing that stuff every week or every month. You're lucky if you can do it once a year or once every 6 months. So it can be really hard to understand the nuances, especially in rapidly changing growth areas where they are significantly different, year on year, to understand how these places are actually doing. And when we think about the impact of that, I ask the question, what kind of places are we actually creating when we think about the communities that we shape, if the only stuff that we can actually measure in real time is things like car parking volumes and traffic speed? There's the old adage that we don't manage what we don't measure. And so if we want to be actually making great communities where people feel included and not lonely and all of these other things, we need to be able to measure that stuff, or else we can't be held to account for it or understand which of our programs are actually working, what the most significant change is that we're creating. But it actually doesn't need to be this hard. And these days, because of the pervasiveness of technology, and most people in this room probably have one small computer somewhere in their pocket or on their wrist or in their car, if not many, there's actually huge volumes of data being created all the time. In the last few minutes, there have been many, many millions of Google searches take place worldwide on any of the 4 billion internet-enabled smartphones. There are now more mobile phones globally than there are toothbrushes, so there's a lot of data being created all the time. Lots of people are uploading all sorts of stuff on YouTube every few minutes. 4 billion Snapchats sent in Australia every day. That number's going up all the time. So, hundreds of thousands in sort of 15 minutes or so. And also now in Australia, there are 3 million more active Facebook users than people enrolled to vote. So if we want to think about where there is data about how people live and what they do and what they value, this is all of a sudden a critical mass of data that tells us how people are living and how they're spending their time. And so we as city makers or people working in urban planning are kind of the last industry on board with this. For a long time, advertising companies have been using this kind of data in real time to know where to put billboards around the city, and supermarkets use it to price bananas, to look at what healthy food and family habits are happening in and around different neighbourhoods, and so they have that dynamic pricing, particularly on bananas. And yeah, I know, it's a fun fact, it's true. And so when we think about what this might mean and how this kind of data, and I'm not talking about looking at people's personal Facebook accounts, there are people that do that, but there's tons of data that you can use that isn't about people's personal Facebook accounts, but think about the kind of information that an app like Strava has in it, about the routes that people are riding to and from, or when you look at Eventbrite and all the venues that are hosting events, when you think about people tagging themselves or checking into restaurants, and you can start to see what the nighttime economy might look like across different parts of the city. So visualising some of that very quickly, this is just some locations in Singapore, big new urban renewal area, and then downtown Chinatown in Singapore. If we just quickly map what the social data might look like across these communities, Chinatown has a huge diverse social data footprint because it's been there a long time. There's lots of different kinds of people going there using it all the time, not so much in the new urban renewal precinct. Another international example, and I've got some Australian ones coming up, but Nairobi, looking at what Nairobi as a city looks like, not only downtown CBD, but also one of the informal slum settlements out on the outskirts of the city, refugee settlement. Downtown Nairobi has the most data we've ever found anywhere of any city in the world, and that it's because that as a community they use mobile devices for many payments as well. So there's huge data footprint, data being created all the time. We've got 8 million data points in a 24-hour period in downtown Nairobi, which really shows you the social life or the economic life of that place. And even in the refugee settlement on the outskirts, quite a lot of data coming through there. So this settlement isn't even mapped, and it has this kind of data coming out of it in real time, so you can see what's happening and what the economy looks like in this place. And so what we at Neighbourlytics did, we're actually ex-placemakers. So we came from, Dean's background and Ethan's background, looking at how to get out into communities and work with local people to create great places. And we were frustrated with how hard it was to really understand what was going on in those communities and then quantify the impact of that. So we developed this platform, which is what Neighbourlytics is, which pulls together lots of different information sources and asks it questions around what are the local places within that community, what does the social life look like, and what are the community values? How can we learn that from all this real-time data, and we visualise that? And so I've got a couple of quick case studies I'm going to jump into, and please ask me questions in the panel discussion too. Please ask me the privacy question, because I know you're all thinking it. I won't waste my presentation on it, but ask me. So first one, looking at how this data can be used. We do tons of work in growth areas. One of the biggest client types that we have is either state or local state government agencies or local government or property developers with new community greenfield contexts. And they're all asking us, what is the unique local story of these places? Because when you look at them, they might look the same. And so this is some work we've done for the VPA in Victoria, Epping, Taylors Hill and Cranbourne, and looking at what, these places are all fairly similar in age. It could, an arrogant urban designer might walk down the street and think they're all the same and they've all got the same sorts of things going on, or that they might be dormitory suburbs because people are going to get in their cars and drive into the city. And some of that might be true, but when we look at the social data footprint of these, and I'm sorry, it's a bit faded, the backdrop, so you can't quite see it, but I'll tell you what it says. Each of these communities has a rich data footprint of all the things happening in these places. So we see tons of home businesses. So one of the first things people do when they start a home business is not register for GST. Actually, it's put it on Google, put it on Facebook, start posting on Instagram. So that stuff starts to come up in this social data before it's a formal business. And then over time, you can start to track the formalisation of these businesses. At what time do they register for GST? When do they get a website? When do they move premises out of a home into something else? You can start to see in real time how these things are changing. And then when we look at these communities and compare them to each other, we can see that places like Cranbourne have lots of home businesses and business chatter, a very active business ecosystem happening there, and we can dive right down into what's driving that and what kinds of businesses they are. Taylors Hill had much more community active physical things happening, so meetups and fitness groups and things like that in the local parks. That was very much part of the footprint there. And then Epping, we were seeing lots of chatter around the construction workers. So even before the residents are moving in, the construction workers are having an impact on the local economy and what's happening in that place, and you can see that coming up. And then as the new residents are moving in, parents group meetups and stuff like that started to happen. So you can start to see that without going into anyone's personal social media account or anything like that, you can use these unconventional digital sources to really see the true change in real time across these sorts of communities and how they are actually very different, and they all start to have local success stories and things, grassroots things that are happening that can be tapped into. And then beyond that, we can also say, what does the social life look like, or what are the behaviours of the people that are there? So when people are posting images online, they're a great indicator of the things that they did that they want their friends to know that they did. So people don't post themselves dropping off their dry cleaning, but if they have just gone vegan or are training for a marathon or just renovating their home, it's online. And so you can start to see neighbourhood by neighbourhood where those sorts of things are happening and how it changes over time as well. Very easy to compare these sorts of places. Some neighbourhoods, it's all about pets in sweaters, or the AFL, or the same-sex marriage vote. Across Melbourne, there was all sorts of different chatter across the city based on things like that. And then that can be tracked across, months of the year as well. How does it change from November, December, January, February? This is some work that we did in Victoria, looking at how the business ecosystem started to increase in what people were talking about in the social chatter. And then also once the parks started to open and programming opened in the parks and the weather warmed up, it was snowing at my house outside Melbourne yesterday. Public realm starts to come up much more in there as well. So I won't dwell on some of the other case studies, but it's very easy to think about how to scale this up across a whole city and compare lots and lots of neighbourhoods together in a way you just can't do with focus groups or other sorts of more manual research, and then directly compare neighbourhoods to one another. And what we're working on at the moment is, because we now have a database of 700 neighbourhoods across 10 countries, we can start to say what good looks like. And so we've just released a piece of work, and there's a pilot out of Darwin that just was announced last week, where we multiply this data up and say, what does it tell us about social wellbeing, and how can we then understand in what ways cities are performing from an economic wellbeing, physical wellbeing and community wellbeing perspective, so that that can actually be tracked properly over time. So I'm going to leave it there, but please ask me lots of questions. Thanks.